Welcome to this edition of Purger's Podcast. We are continuing on with the Age of Revolution, and today we're discussing Georg Hegel. He was around during the years 1770 to 1831, and we can think of him as a philosopher of history. So if history is your thing, this philosopher should be of particular interest to you. Hegel recognized a problem with a lot of the attitudes of people of his time. He found out that in modern times, people like to think of past cultures as primitive or less advanced, and they always assume that because we live after them chronologically, we must be more wise. I'm sure you can appreciate that reality today even. Think about how people discuss things, right? How we have such advanced scientific knowledge now that we are so much smarter than anyone that came before us. But Hegel challenged that assumption and found out many interesting things. Instead of making the easy assumption that we are always on an upward trajectory of knowledge and wisdom as we go through history, Hegel preferred to think of history, every era in history, as a container or a house of a certain kind of wisdom. So you might have a certain kind of wisdom 2,000 years ago, and then another kind of wisdom 1,000 years ago. Whenever there are great civilizations or great societies, or at least ones that have a lot of power and influence, we can probably find some kind of wisdom within their culture. That is what Hegel was interested in. So he said we should look back in history to rescue wisdom that has gone missing. Notice how that is a direct contradiction to what many people assume, that we can't really learn that much from the past except how to not make the same mistakes. Hegel disagreed. He says there is a lot of wisdom in the past, and it's gone missing because people are too arrogant today and think that everything that we do today is naturally better. But we need to find the wisdom that we have forgotten about. Think of it this way. Maybe ancient Greece had a better idea of what community should be. Think of the details of what we studied when we thought of the philosophers from that time, of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Are you trying to tell me that those people were fools or ignorant and had nothing valuable to offer? Well, it seems likely that that is not true. So perhaps there were things in their society that we would challenge today and say they were definitely doing that wrong by today's moral standards. But there could also be some truth to the idea that they were doing something very wise, perhaps even more wise than we are doing today. So perhaps the Greeks had a better sense of what community should be, the way that they got along, the way that they integrated with each other, the way that they conducted society could be better, even though they had much less advanced technology than we have today, obviously. Today, we have great technological advances, but many of these have divided us, disconnected us from each other. And I'm sure you can think of examples of how that is true. Maybe the Middle Ages, another time period, showed us a better understanding of what honor is. Maybe that time period of knights and chivalry and looking out for each other and putting your life on the line. It could exist in some aspects of society today, but it was definitely a lot more common then. It characterized the age. Perhaps that was wise, and perhaps we've lost some of that wisdom today by being cynical and not caring about the same kinds of things. Today, people might not have as deep a sense of loyalty to country. They think of that as a bad thing, as extreme nationalism. Maybe they don't even have as deep a sense of family today because many of societal standards and values have changed and people start seeing things as, a little bit more arbitrary and less serious. They try to break from religious ideas if that's where the ideas came from. Even something as simple as keeping your word, right? Not lying to people, being honest. Perhaps today people laugh at that. They shrug and say, well, it doesn't matter if we lie and deceive each other. There's a lot of game shows that do that to win a cash prize. Lying in reality, in real life, is okay if it gets you ahead. A lot of people are very cynical in that way, and they don't feel a strong sense in their core that they want to be as honest and truthful as possible all of the time. And why is that? Why have those moral standards changed? Have they changed? And is it possible that past time periods have treated these things with more respect and more clarity than we do today? A key concept that Hegel focused on a lot in his philosophy is something known as the spirit of the times. The actual spirit or Geist of a time period can manifest itself in a few people. Sometimes this word Geist is expanded into the word Zeitgeist, which simply is referring to what is the air of the time, right? What is your culture and society like? What is the spirit of your society all about? And sometimes you can have leaders or just people in society that become very well known that represent that Geist, represent the spirit of your time, represent the heart of your culture. Many times these people are completely unaware of the role they are playing in history. Sometimes it's very hard to realize in the moment how important you are in the grand scheme of things, because maybe you just aren't that observant, maybe you're more humble, too humble to recognize that. Maybe you're just caught up in the moment and doing the best you can to be a good person, and you don't realize the impact you've had until you look back. Or maybe you don't even realize it at all during your lifetime, and only history judges what you're able to contribute to your society. So sometimes your legacy is not actually something that exists until long after you're gone. Sometimes people can come along that are so influential in impacting the Geist of their times that every moment of their life is tracked in history, and they are perhaps even studied in history all over the world for the rest of time as one of those figures that is almost impossible to imagine. So an example of this type of person is Napoleon Bonaparte. He's an individual who best encapsulates the spirit of the French Revolution. And naturally, he became the figure who leads the masses through it. If you've heard the words microcosm and macrocosm before, you can think of Napoleon's personality and life as a microcosm of the large-scale French Revolution macrocosm. So everything that he does, he is the guiding force of the revolution, his personality represents the revolution, and he is the most important figure of the entire French Revolution. So everything about him is all tied in with that monumental historical event. There is nothing about human beings that is not historical in nature. Hegel says this. He says it's not random. Our individual consciousness grows into a movement which gets represented by a symbolic figure of that consciousness who contributes greatly to the progress of history. That was quite the paragraph. Let's try to unpack that a little bit. So I think what Hegel is trying to say here is that a lot of people think that history is something that's happening to people, right? People are in a certain slice of history and they're trapped within that and they live out their lives in whatever time period they're born in. He is flipping that. He is saying essentially that people create their own history. They are the ones that are creating what we call their historical time period. They weren't existing within it. The history, the time period, came from them. So an individual consciousness, the way that you are, your Geist, can spread amongst your society and combine with other people's. And eventually it leads to a certain figure emerging from your society who best represents what everybody else wants, what the spirit of the times is. So during the French Revolution, there was clearly a desire for massive change throughout all of Europe. People wanted to cast away the monarchy system and the feudal system, and they wanted something called democracy, where everybody individually had rights and was treated as equal to one another. So this is what causes progress in history. That progress during that time period was because of the individual consciousness growing into a movement and expanding into a revolution that was represented by a historical figure known as Napoleon Bonaparte. And he was the monumental figure that represented, as best as anyone could, the Geist of his time. This is a very cool philosophical idea, as Hegel is saying that it is actually observable, that we can see our consciousness literally create our reality. There's been so much discussion up to this point in philosophy about what our reality is and how to define it and describe it, while he is trying to do it in historical context, that we actually create our own reality through our spirit of the times, our Geist, our motivations, our desires, our instincts, our intuitions. Everything that we want our society to be comes from us, from our consciousness. It combines with everybody else around us, and it gets encapsulated in a certain figure that naturally must arise in a way that is predictable and undeniable. And that figure will represent your entire time. And there could be multiple figures, right? But these figures or this figure represent your time so well that they are the historical remembrance of that entire spirit of the time. Again, this gets rid of the idea that everything is just random, right? That you are randomly born into a time period, you exist during that time period, and then some other time period happens. That's not what's happening according to Hegel. He is saying that history is some sort of mysterious force. It has a direction. It has an endpoint. We're actually going somewhere in the future that we're not aware of yet because we don't know what the spirit of the times will be. But we know what the spirit of the times is now, perhaps. We're recognizing it. We can definitely study what the spirit of the times were in the past. And history will continue to move forward in this way. We're operating during a stage right now. The French Revolution was a stage of history, and there will be stages in the future. And eventually we will get to some stage at the end, and perhaps there is a conclusion to history that we're unaware of at this point. This is kind of cool because it defines history as a story, literally. Right? People always think of stories of history anyways, but it's because that's just the way it's taught or that's the way you learn it. But Hegel is saying philosophically, history is a story. There are stages or chapters in that story, and we are not at the end of the story yet. We're somewhere in the middle. We can't possibly know where we are in the story, but we can recognize the spirit of our times and the spirit of the times that came before us. Now let's get back to that idea of ancient wisdom. There's a kind of old-fashioned saying that goes, separate the wheat from the chaff, or don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. These refer to the idea that if there's a bad idea and you're trying to get rid of it, you want to find the good within the bad as well. You don't just throw everything out, you try to find the good parts. So of course, past societies have also shown terrible treatment of people in many ways. Hegel is not saying that we should model our societies after everything they did. Right? So we shouldn't look back at ancient Greece or ancient Rome or anything like that and say, oh, they were perfect, let's base our society off of that and just do everything that they did. We don't need to be an exact copy of them, but we should also have the ability to recognize when they did something very right. Find that ancient wisdom and use it today. Another way of thinking of this is to say that progress is never linear. Just because we are farther along in time does not mean that we are automatically more wise than everyone before us. Why would you assume that history is always improving? Don't you accept the possibility that we can have great progress in one time and then revert back in another time? Have times of light, times of darkness, times of scientific progress and moral progress, and times when that goes backwards. So it's that idea of one step forward, two steps back. Or maybe it's two steps forward and one step back. Regardless of how much progress is being made, it can definitely go in cycles. So good times, bad times. What's amazing about this perspective is it's actually a great individual and historical lesson. It's important to look at history this way because it's a better way of understanding how progress is made. Modern cultures can take backward steps before moving forwards. But this is also a great individual lesson because you can't always expect to improve in predictable ways. You can't just assume that if I work out, I'll continue to get stronger, or if I practice this, I will always get better. There might be times when you get stuck or maybe even go backwards because of certain obstacles in your way. By recognizing that there can be movement forward and movement backwards, it can prevent you from giving up or not being able to deal with one of those obstacles or deal with one of those times when things get worse. So it gives you better resilience, it gives you better perspective, and it probably gives you a better chance of improvement individually or historically. Right? Imagine being a person who says, as soon as something bad goes wrong, I'm giving up, I'm quitting. Or you can be somebody that works through the tough times and then rides the wave of progress. So it's important to realize that there is wisdom at every stage of history. We can always find something that is a kernel of truth, or even great wisdom at every stage can be found if you look hard enough. Let's not dismiss things that came before us. Let's try to incorporate them into ourselves. And it's like we're taking the best of every time period, the best of every stage, and incorporating them into one massive bundle of wisdom that we can use to move forward. And without taking all of that wisdom and combining it together, how are we ever going to get to the conclusion of the story? So the important task of a historian or a philosopher is to find those hidden gems of wisdom to fill in the cultural blind spots of today. It's doing the simple task of looking at your society, recognizing where they've gone wrong, recognizing where they do not have enough nuance, do not have enough wisdom, and trying to fill in the gaps with the ancient wisdom. Find the hidden gems, bring them back into your society, and teach people how to incorporate those into their own lives. This is a much more complex and complicated way of dealing with history, so a lot of people don't like to do that. They like to simply look at history and say, well, that was a bad time, an uneducated time, an unscientific time, so let's dismiss it all and use the technology and wisdom of today. Well, that might be a fatal flaw as well. By forgetting and ignoring the ancient wisdom, we might not be able to make progress today completely. A very good lesson of life is that progress involves obstacles. Take a look at this split chart to understand what I mean. On the left, you see how people think success looks. A continuous, never-ending improvement. I'm going to work hard and I'm always going to succeed. If you have that attitude, it might seem very optimistic and very positive and helpful. But it might lead you astray because you're assuming that you're always going to improve in a linear way. On the right-hand side, we have how success actually looks. We have a plateau where you're improving, and then we have a dip or a struggle. Then we might have a leap forward where a lot of progress is made in a short amount of time. Then we have another plateau where it's slow and steady increase. Then we have a dip where the resilience is needed. Then we have a leap forward, a lot of progress is made, and then we have a plateau. So you need patience during the plateaus. You need to remain stable and constant during the leaps, and during the dips you have to be resilient. This is true progress. Hegel gave us another great lesson from his philosophy. He said that we need to learn from ideas you dislike. This goes back to things we discussed at the very beginning of this course. It's about philosophical perspective. We must realize that there will always be points of view that we disagree with, or even find alien or hard to consider. We want to shut them out. We don't want to hear them. They're too difficult or too annoying. But hearing different opinions is always helpful, even if they are extremely offensive or perhaps even dangerous. We need to challenge those ideas instead of dismissing them. Because when things are out in the open, we can deal with them. But when they are hidden, they can become even more intrusive or more dangerous. They can rot out the core of society. So hearing different opinions is part of the process of philosophy. If you can't present a good, strong counter-argument to an idea, and you simply want to dismiss it because you don't like it, then you are failing the cause. Remember, there may be slivers of truth hidden within ideas that seem frightening. You hear an idea and it echoes in your gut, makes you feel terrible, and your instincts say that's a bad idea, and you're scared of it. But what if you can find a little sliver of truth, a little grain of wisdom in there? The big idea might be wrong or flawed, but there might be some truth to it, and if you consider it, if you give the benefit of the doubt, you can come to a compromise or at least move beyond the bad argument. Remember that principle we learned, the principle of charity. We need to focus on the most fair interpretation of what people say, not the worst. In today's society, especially online, and they use that trick. So what you're saying is they try to put words in people's mouths. They try to spin what people say. They try to use those logical fallacies of creating straw man arguments or using ad hominem attacks. But this is not a healthy way of having conversations. We want to look for a fair interpretation of what people say, not the worst interpretation. So think of the example of nationalism, an idea that is somewhat controversial. Extreme nationalism has influenced world wars, genocides, horrible atrocities in the world, and other human acts. The good part of nationalism, the basic human reality within it, is that people like to be proud of where they come from. It's part of our identity as individuals. Nobody would say that's a bad thing to be proud of where you're from. But extreme nationalism can lead to such horrible things. This is why life is nuanced. You can't just look at the idea of nationalism and say it's bad or it's good. You need to look at the circumstances and realize that when taken to an extreme, many ideas can be dangerous. But when handled properly, they can be quite good. So really important ideas might be held and or discussed by people you really don't like or even find intolerable. This is another challenge of being a good philosopher. Sometimes your human emotions get the better of you. You see somebody that you have heard a lot about, heard really bad things about. You have judgments, you have preconceptions. You've heard a lot of what they have to say and you don't like it. You don't find what they say to be even tolerable in any way. But try an experiment sometime. Try to drop all of those emotions. Stop trying to have assumptions about people and just assume that all people know something worthwhile. Even the person that you dislike the most and you hate their ideas, try to look at them in a simply objective way. Don't prejudge them. Just listen to what they have to say without any assumptions rolling around in your mind. Because if you're full of assumptions, you're going to be looking for hateful things that they're about to say, or you're going to be spinning all of their ideas into something they might not even mean. So just remember the logical fallacies. We want to examine the arguments. Listen to the ideas for what they are. Don't worry about who the person is. Remember, people say ideas, but they don't even have to be that strongly connected. Ideas can have people. People don't have ideas. That's an interesting way of saying that we can separate the two. We don't want to attack a person and dismiss all of their ideas because of the feelings we have towards that person. What we should be doing is simply listening to the idea and unpacking it and saying, no, I disagree for this reason. I have a better argument. I have a better idea. I see the fault in your arguments and your ideas. That is how we do it. Focus on the ideas, not on the people. Think back to what real progress looks like. We have to admit to ourselves that progress is messy. Society makes progress by jumping from one extreme to another while trying to overcompensate for previous mistakes. We might look back at a time and say they were doing that horribly wrong, so let's swing the pendulum all the way the other way, and then you're at another extreme. So that's no good. So how can we find balance in that progress? Well, the progress of change takes about 3 back and forth moves across generations before the right balance is found. Hegel called this dialectic. Now, we've heard the word dialectic in other contexts, like Socrates' method of dialectic by asking questions. This is a different kind of dialectic. Dialectic in this sense means, imagine history is a pendulum. It swings to one extreme, people realize it's wrong and they swing the other way, but then it goes to another extreme, and then it swings back the other way, and then it swings back the other way. But eventually, the pendulum will find the right balance. It'll find a combination that works between those two extremes. We don't like the extremes. We like the balance. How can we find that balance? Sometimes it's not easy. We might live in a time of extreme and not get the good fortune of living in the time of balance. But we can try our best individually to help restore that balance through what we say and how we behave. Here's a good historical example. Victorian attitudes about sex in the 1800s were extremely conservative. If you know anything about that time period, it was all about being proper, never talking about salacious things in society, always behaving in a extremely high-mannered way. So that could be seen as one extreme. Then we have the sexual revolution of the 1960s, with the hippie movement, the summer of love. It's often viewed as far too liberal. Some people are very uncomfortable with how far that went to that extreme. While perhaps in our time period, in the 2020s and beyond, we might find the right balance between extremes. Maybe we'll level out both of those extremes and we'll find what we can all deal with in a fairly acceptable way. Now it's frustrating though. This can be a slow process and seem like a waste of time. But Hegel thinks it's inevitable. There's no point bickering or whining or complaining about how slow the process is. You can't stop it. That's just how history works. It goes from one extreme to another, and eventually we settle on a balance. This is how it works. History is progress. Progress is messy. The pendulum swings back and forth, but eventually it levels out, and you just have to do the best you can with the situation you're in. What is the goal? The ultimate goal of this dialectic is to synthesize the good parts of the past. The past eras gave us something. They gave us that ancient wisdom. We take that, we combine it with something new, and hopefully we have something better to move forward with, to move from our chapter closer to the conclusion of the story of history. This last idea is going to be a transition into our next lesson. So let's wrap up with this. Hegel says that art is the sensuous presentation of ideas. He completely rejected the notion of art for art's sake, that it is a meaningless creative expression, that you just do it because you're trying to express your creativity. So when he refers to art, he's referring to all of it: painting, music, architecture, literature, anything that is a creative expression from human individuality allows important insights to become powerful and helpful in our lives. So he sees more. He sees a deeper reality to what art is all about. Knowing facts is good, but leaves us cold to the deeper truths. This is how I like to classify the idea of intelligence versus wisdom. There are a lot of people that think intelligence is just knowing a lot of facts. But what if there's somebody who has accumulated a lot of wisdom over their lifetime through experiences, through observation, through reading? They don't necessarily just memorize a lot of facts, but they seem to understand deeper truths about reality. They can teach people lessons through storytelling or through sharing of their experiences. So seeing these ideas portrayed dramatically in art is often way more helpful than simply hearing the facts. Think about cultures that have relied on an oral tradition. They don't just have a bunch of things written down that you're supposed to learn. They passed on traditions and passed on the ideas of their culture through dance, through story, through oral tradition. Think of all the lessons that you've learned from reading stories as a child or watching movies and TV shows over your life. Things that you have deep within you that are part of your character, part of your identity, part of your lessons of life. Many of those are probably deeply rooted because you saw them portrayed in an artistic expression. I wonder if you've sat back and thought about it. Why do you have certain character traits or certain ways of feeling in your life, certain lessons or things you feel are right or wrong? It's possible that many of those came from the things that you saw over your life. And what I mean by things, I mean artistic expressions, the movies you watched, the stories that were read to you, the books you've read, the TV shows you've seen. The lessons that we see portrayed or acted out are often much stronger within us. There's something about the experience of art that we are connected to it in a way that we understand the way that life is, or the deeper meanings of life, or the lessons of life. Maybe you haven't thought about story analysis in this deep way, but it is actually true that there are a small group of universal human themes that can play out in countless number of ways. You can watch 1,000 movies or read 1,000 books that you assume are all very different from each other, but there might only be 5 to 10 universal themes within all of those books, and all you're reading or all you're seeing is simply different variations of those same universal themes. So all of the Shakespeare stories, the Harry Potter series, the Marvel Universe, all of these very popular stories are constructed around the same universal themes. And that doesn't mean that we're very unoriginal as a species. It simply means that there are very deep truths, and there aren't that many of them, which is good. It simplifies things. There is a simple list of universal themes that matters the most to us, that shows us how to live as good people, that gives us an example of what it means to live a good life. And what most people think of as the best stories are the ones that portray these universal themes in the most honest way. When you hit the core of these themes with amazing characters, amazing plot, and you're very honest about what the themes are and how they should portray themselves in art, those are the stories that most people love. And that is a very interesting and predictable thing about humans that we're going to study more deeply next time. Welcome to this edition